Hello, welcome to the Skylight Books podcast. I am so delighted to have Maggie Nelson here to read from her newest book, Like Love. More than any other writer, Maggie has widened my capacity to think. That way of thinking is generous, challenging, and always precise. Words like fluid, expansive, and capacious come to mind when I think of the effect her work imparts. A common response is that in reading her, one feels more free. It is a pleasure to think through things with Nelson, to watch her mind work. She makes criticism feel pleasurable, exciting, invigorating, a necessary part of being alive. Nelson wrote an entire book about freedom, a book I've turned to many times since its publication in 2021. In a passage I've returned to time and time again, Nelson writes, if we want to divest from habits of paranoia, despair, and policing that have come to menace and control even the most well-intentioned of us, habits that, when continuously indulged, shape what's possible in both our present and future, we are going to need methods by which we feel and know what other ways of being are possible, not just in some revolutionary future that may never come, or in some idealized past that likely never existed or is irretrievably lost, but right here and now. This is David Graeber's point about acting as if one is already free. And while this sometimes means more protest and puppets, as is Graeber's wont, it can mean the development of more understated practices by which one develops a greater tolerance for indeterminacy, as well as the joys and pains of our unescapable relation. Nelson's latest book, Like Love, is a must-read for fans of her work, featuring critical essays, profiles, and conversations which range from Prince to a dream conversation between her and Bjork. It offers fascinating insight into Nelson's own development as a writer and thinker, which is a gift to us all. Maggie Nelson is the author of several books of prose and poetry, including The Red Parts, Bluets, the National Book Critics Circle Award winner, The Argonauts, and On Freedom. She teaches at the University of Southern California and lives in Los Angeles. And Maggie, if you don't mind, I would love for you to start with a little reading from Like Love.
I would be glad to. I'm glad to be here. And so this is the preface. It's called Lights Up, and I'll read 2 pages of it. It goes like this. The credits have started to roll. The theater is still dark. A mother, my mother, leans over to whisper, well, what did you think? What did I think? How could anyone be composed enough to be thinking, talking? My job is clear. I must protect the transmission, smuggle it out of the theater, to examine it later in my room, see if it still glows. If it does, I might start to think in sentences about it. If the sentences get bossy enough, I might start to write them down. This much I've learned. You put enough in, and eventually, if unpredictably, something will come out. James Baldwin, quote, all artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up, end quote. My mother took me to much of the first art I ever saw, from John Waters to Jeff Koons. A lot of it was beyond me. Some of it freaked me the fuck out. Some of it moved me. In response, I acted like a sullen and bored child. Now I am that mother. And I can much more easily imagine the hope, the thrill even, she must have felt in bringing me around, in having an after-show companion. I'm afraid I wasn't much good for it. I was too busy being born. And I'm not much good for it now either. And yet, by fending off her inquiries, I grew to understand what I was trying to protect. By beholding her desire to engage, I learned something about the craving for connection that art conjures, frustrates, and possibly exists to satisfy. I learned that finding out what you think or feel about something can take time, and that time is always worth taking. I learned that art is one way we live together in this world, even as it relates and separates us, like Hannah Arendt's famous table. A table suggests that nourishment might ensue, but this is a possibility, not a promise. Maybe the table will become a theater for our deprivation. Maybe something else will happen there entirely. I think often of Hilton Als's assertion that, quote, every mouth needs filling with something wet or dry like love, or unfamiliar and savory like love, end quote. I think about it a lot because I don't quite understand it. Does he mean that love is an example of something that could fill a mouth? Or does he mean that something like love could do the trick? What is something like love but not love? Would such a thing be a cruel, perhaps the cruelest of substitutes? Or can something that's like love but not love offer its own form of sustenance? How would one know the difference? How can the attention one pays to art be an act of love or something like it, if and when the love object, words, sounds, paint, pixels, cannot love you back? Or is this simply semantics? We feel love, after all the time for things and people who don't love us back, or at least not in any provably reciprocal fashion. Who is to say whether or how these trees or this God loves us anyway? I started getting asked to write about art by friends as soon as I landed in New York City when I was 21. I knew virtually nothing about it, so the requests flummoxed me. But I quickly gleaned that there was a long history in New York and beyond of poets writing about art. And if I wanted to take part, I'd better start looking and learning. My first invitation to contribute to a catalog came from the inaugural Greater New York show at PS1 in 2000. All we had to do, the invitation said, was pick one piece of art that compelled us and write something about it in any form or style. I arrived at the museum quaking, dinky notebook in hand, wordless, until I stumbled upon the work of Nicola Tyson, which instantly demanded my attention. I gave it, and words followed. Over the next 20-odd years, this cycle recurred, each time teaching me more about how the act of bestowing attention serves as its own reward, and how such engagement attaches and reattaches me to curiosity, to others, to life, especially when my own spirits have dimmed. This is a quote. I don't want to talk about this show too much, but I've been asked to. And in order to survive in a culture of explanation, one must explain, end quote. Hilton Als says in an essay about James Baldwin, Jim Brown, and the Children, a show he put together for the Artists Institute in 2016. He goes on, but how to explain the heart, a sensibility, love. I love all the artists in this show. I am looking at the artists in this show and introducing them to you through words because it is all that is left to me here. End quote. I don't want to talk too much about this collection either. In fact, I resisted writing a preface to it for some time and could start only by conjuring a first fraught memory of resisting the call to explicate, of that juvenile self who fears language might ruin aesthetic experience. Language is forced on art, says Rachel Harrison. Is that really best for art? Is that really good for art? Does that make art happy? Probably not. Probably language does not make art happy. Language does not always make me happy. But sometimes you must explain. And not just because someone asked or because we live in a culture of explanation, but because one wants to, needs to. The language rises up and upchuck. Words aren't just what's left, they're what we have to offer. And so, offering in hand, we join the party. We put ourselves in range of something that's neither a cruel substitute nor a consolation prize, but that has all of love's energy, its excitation, its devotion to detail, its flushed conviction of meaning, its sense that it's worth it to stay in it, no matter the repulsion or boredom or misunderstanding or suffering. At which point, it doesn't really matter if the energy is love or like love. What matters is that we're turned on, we're in the game. Quote, I don't really see the work as a vehicle for expressing an idea about my sexuality. I see it as another form of practicing my sexuality. End quote, Nayland Blake. All right.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to start there because I was thinking a lot about why I think people feel when they read your work so free. Like that's a refrain that comes up a lot. And this idea that maybe you as a writer, as a person, or the way that you occupy the page, you don't have any shame. Or that's sometimes projected onto you. And it was really interesting rereading and sitting with your work and remembering that you were a dancer,
Mm.
and that you also swim. And I was just really curious about your relationship to writing and the body, because you
Mhm.
are such a bodily writer, and
Mhm.
not only because you speak about your bodies and other bodies so intimately, but also, you use phrases like "we're turned on," "we're in the game,"
Yeah,
which
yeah,
I so enjoy and has felt so revelatory, because
yeah.
thinking for you is active, right? Like criticism can feel so stale,
Yeah.
so cold, alienating. But when I read you, I never feel that way, and I feel like the work of living is connected to thinking. So I would just
Mhm.
love for you to say more about that.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think that, yeah, I guess two things. One, I think that, because some people have this kind of idea that like the critical is this cerebral exercise upon the like visceral, creative act or whatever. And I think, one thing I hope is clear in this book and elsewhere is, part of not having that division means that you don't make that kind of dividing line in your work where like here, this will be, on the pulses and in the game. And over here will be, rehearsing this kind of dry cerebral exercise. I don't really experience any, I think if any sphere of writing feels like that to you, like not in the game or, dry, or you're boring yourself or others, then like you're in the, like, get out, just like, I want to get out. Like, I can't, why would I want to be there? And then, so the second thing that occurs to me is just what you say about, dance or swimming or, um, I think, I came up in poetry and also like a scene in which poetry was, um, not like a slam scene or anything like that, and not like performance poetry like that, but, where there was like a real deep appreciation of like the act of, of like putting words into like a room that was alive. And I ran the open mic night at the St. Mark's Poetry Project for a number of years, and where anybody could kind of come in and do anything, and that was a heavy load to figure out how to manage in the middle of the East Village and stuff. And I think, but it also was in a continuum with other forms of performance. So somebody might get up and do a dance, or someone might, and other forms of um, dance that I was involved with were, some were choreographed, but a lot had to do with improvisation. And improvisation is very, it's like training to be in a space and be kind of continually imagining what might be interesting for your body to go in and do. And it doesn't have a kind of preciousness like, oh, what if I go in and do it and it was the wrong thing to do? Like, part of being in the game is that it's like, then the next thing has to happen and the next thing has to happen, and like you're kind of you're composing on the spot to try and figure out, and people who don't like watching that kind of thing, and I probably don't like watching it as much as I used to, but I watched a lot of it and really felt like I learned from watching improvisatory dance. And I'm sure people have this with listening to improvisatory music, like what a kind of like literal being in the game, meant on the spot, about how you learn how to compose. And writing's very different because you spend a lot of time alone in your room and you edit it and you re-edit it. But I think the artifice of it is that, you're trying to get at something of this like meta structure about, you know, intervening or a gesture or, in a conversation, knowing that it has this temporal element that's going to, kind of give it, I don't know, just like give it more levels, in terms
Mhm.
of, when it appears in the world. And so but all that's very, it's been very interesting to me. And I think that some of my early mentors like Eileen Miles, who would never want me to call them a mentor because they don't like that word, but like, but I think, being around like Eileen's body as a like vessel for their poetry, those were kind of some of the lessons that I took that were very important to me, which is partly why I think there's a lot of people in this book like, um, Matthew Barney is a very like athletic, like athleticism is really important in his work. And I mean, all painters, I mean, Kara Walker, like Talamadani, like have, there's a real relationship of their body in the space to what they're doing. And obviously Bjork as a singer, I mean, there's a lot of, and Lasse Sela, there's a lot of, I think writing's really dissimilar from those things, but I feel a lot of affinity and interest in their practices.
Mm. I'm intrigued by this idea of the permission to get out, as you spoke of earlier, because I don't know if that's always a natural instinct. I find that really admirable or even surprising the time. There is this sense in your work that, you're so willing to take what you need and leave the rest. I think that's something you even say. And yeah, that comfort with shifting, with not resting in one place. And do you think that's something that has always been part of your personality, or you've always been bent in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, it has a negative cast in that, like it's a restlessness that, you have to make sure it doesn't like tip into impatience, so I think you have to like, you have to stay long enough with with boredom or something not happening, enough to, but I think that's why I like a lot of art. Like if you like a certain kind of, if you're into a certain film or whatever, and there's parts of it that you're like, this is really boring, it's like you've committed. So, hopefully you're not going to like fast forward. You're just like, all right, well, we'll just let this long screen of, all red just go for however long it goes. And so I think it's like a back and forth about determining when to stay in. But I do think that, there's a kind of, I mean, there's different kinds of scholarship. Like, I think it's fine. I'm not against, like, I don't think like a certain kind of magpie, like pick and choose modality that might be natural to me is like in any shape or form, like the best or like or the only way. It's just one way. And it, I think allows to think less about maybe like individual thinkers and what they kind of like evaluating them, like judging them. And it allows you to kind of get above it and kind of see this greater flow. And I think Fred Moten's work is, helpful here because like in that essay that I think I name in here from Moten, by sociality, from sociality, what's it called? I get it right. Yeah, by sociality to sociality. And, it's like, I think he's talking, I just want to make sure that I get it right because it's important. So like, yeah, he's talking about Bessie Smith, and he says, he talks about what we've come to recognize under the name of Bessie Smith, and what Bessie Smith was sent to give us a message about. She was an effective sociality, sent by sociality to sociality in a way that gives us this thing to understand about entanglement. And so I think it's like, it's not so much picking and choosing, I guess I would say, as like just a practice of impatience or like making a tapestry of like what you want things to say. It's more like, what if we don't need, what if we don't need to obsess on the singularity and the evaluation of individual figures, but we kind of, look at ideas and things as like in a flow, and then we take what we need, like kind of out of that ocean to construct moments of argument or of revelation that is different from, yeah, I don't know if I'm making sense. But,
yeah, I think that is interesting because I think sometimes in academia, maybe there's this sparring or this sense of, yeah, like you're saying, picking and getting so caught up in the granularities and losing sight of the bigger picture. And I think that is a very generous and open way of approaching.
Our problems aren't always with each other, right? Like our problems are with, if someone's expressing some view you feel like is noxious, it's like you kind of have a choice about whether or not you're going to tether that give it like this deep root in them, this kind of like who they are, or whether you're going to hear in it, this, dreadful recurrence of a noxious current, and then see this person as like, unfortunately, having made themselves available to channel it. But I think in the latter, there's a lot more capacity for change than there is in the former. So I think that that's partly why I think it's, not just a kind of, that it's like an ethical practice that I respect as well, because it has to do with not treating people as, just treating people as not disposable, but as changeable.
Absolutely, which is something that I struggle with. And I think a lot of people, I'm 27. I think a lot of people who are inclined, are radical and are inclined to feel energized towards change, but it's so easy to let that way of thinking overtake the politics, which you get at in so many different ways in your book. But I think it's why I found On Freedom, and particularly in the time I was reading it, so clarifying, which, because it allowed room for that openness, like you're saying, that we don't have to get stuck in the roots or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it's not, it's there's times and places and strategies, so it's not like it's not like the whole world can be conducted like a therapy session or a 12-step seminar or a graduate classroom or a conversation on Skylight podcast. There's like there's different scenes, right, of action, but I do think that I mean, this is not really the task of like love, and it's not really my arena per se, but I am, compelled by friends of mine in movement building who understand that there are skill sets that, we abandon at our peril, in the process of building solidarity. So I think depending on the scene in which you're working, different skills are required.
I'm curious, I know you've been teaching for quite some time now, first at Cal Arts, and then now you teach at USC. How has that informed your critical and writing practice throughout the years? And you've seen, I'm sure, an entire generation of students and changes.
Right now, I think.
And waves of thought. And I'm so curious about how it informs your work.
Yeah, I mean, I really like teaching. I don't. It's not like a regrettable part of my life or anything. I think I'd want to do it, at some level. I would prefer to do it than not do it. I think, and before I worked at, I don't know, before I worked at CalArts, I worked for years at different New York universities and stuff. I don't know, I think I've kind of had like I don't know how to describe it, just to kind of, my own singular flow in and out of academic spaces, in that I, went to college, went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and then kind of, but really wanted to leave. And as I, described in Like Love, like go to New York and learn how to be a writer and a performer or whatever, in very non-institutional settings, and did that for a long time. And then, wanted to get a PhD mostly just to be like smarter, just to know more and to have more available to me as a writer, and to kind of, just become more, have more like intellectual power in terms of what I could draw from and think about. So, but I was, wary of the academic enterprise because I didn't really see a place for myself in it, lifestyle wise. So I, went to City University of New York, which was a great choice because it was very, it's very like of the city, not ivory tower-ish in the least, and so but I wasn't really sure when I got my PhD. Again, I still wasn't sure, like, I was a little bit like, I was actually like, maybe I was contemplating managing a restaurant, or I don't know, like I was like other things, like I was yoga teacher training, like I wasn't really sure. And then I got, offered this job in an art school, and that kind of seemed like an interesting, yeah, just like, okay, I'll try this. Like I'll bring the things that I know from this academic realm, but to a fairly non-academic setting. People do not go to CalArts. I mean, we do have, I'm not we there, I'm not anymore, but they do have a master's in aesthetics and politics and their creative writing program. But mostly you go there if you want to be a dancer, or an actor, or a lighting technician, or make non-narrative film, or be an animator, or what have you. So those are not the same as like my, tank of reading and writing and doing critical analyses. So that was a good, but that kind of teaching is really different. Like teaching to artists is really different. And I think what you were saying before about taking what you need and leaving the rest, I would say that characterizes how most creative people interact with philosophy and theory and journalism. It's not about, tracing the blow by blows of an argument. It's about gleaning something that might be useful to you in your own medium. So I think that probably underscored that modality for me for quite some time, and also allowed me to learn about other, to be very steeped in other kinds of intelligences and like neurodiversity that come with art school, less than schools where already to get past the, mode of entrance, you have to have, proven that you have a certain kind of mind that can do these certain things. So I think that is all really important to me. I guess I would just say, because I think a lot of people trying to write about art maybe can't leave enough of their of their particular intellectual formation behind sometimes, like you're already looking for what you want to say about it before you can apprehend anything about it. And I think that is a problem in art writing, and not one that I'm like innocent of. I mean, I think it's always a struggle, but I think that being in that environment very thoroughly was helpful to not be there, like more than I would have elsewise. And then, yeah, USC, I teach in a nonfiction program, and I really enjoy working with the students there who are all in a doctoral program. So they're there for much longer, and much longer than you are in a 2-year art school engagement. So it's just yeah, it's been a lot of different things, but I love I mean, I guess there are some professors who move into a kind of kids these days state of mind, but I think to me, the value of being a professor is giving you a scene to resist that over and over again, and to listen to what the students are saying. And it's not always congruent with the way that you might have constituted yourself, but that's part of that's the fun and the growth of it, So that's why I like teaching. Sorry, that was a really long answer. Yeah.
No, I'm wondering what do they seem to be saying? I mean, I don't know if there are
Quite a
particular.
moment for that question.
Yes, yes, I know. Not to put too much
Yeah.
onto me, but yeah, I guess part of why I'm asking is it feels like a time that is difficult, and
Yeah.
language is difficult, and
Yeah.
I think for better for worse, you're someone who people find clarity from. So maybe that's where my instinct
Yeah.
to ask you is. But what seems to be on people's minds?
I mean, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of things obviously going on right now as we're recording this at a moment of, my own campus. And I just got back from New York. Obviously, campus is there, and real seizures in and around issues of the war in Gaza and protests. But I guess I would just say that, kind of without getting, into like the nitty gritty of the things, I think that students are trying to figure out, and getting difficult lessons, and but still trying to figure out how not to be subjects in an autocracy, you know. And so how and learning that universities are can be a part of, you know, can be drafted into being a part of that project. So I think, um, you know, I am hopeful but not optimistic that um, that question of how to not be a subject in an autocracy or not be, you know, is I would be hopeful that it would not define, you know, the next, you know, generation or two. But you know, I'm not sure. The forces are potent, and yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
That feels really right to me. That
Yeah,
it feels like this pressure, winnowing, pressuring in, and how can we make the situation tenable and a real um, confrontation. I just feel the sense that we're all confronting
yeah, yeah,
something. Like,
yeah,
yeah, we're having to face
yeah.
something, and it
Yeah, it's like the
feels
protests and the responses have, you know, made, you know, they've laid bare a lot of things that are normally operating under, you know, more obfuscation. So again, I think, you know, the optimist in me is like, well, okay, we have this knowledge. So like better to have the knowledge we
absolutely.
than to not have the knowledge, because now we know what the game is. I mean, the game, not in this case, not the same happy game of art writing, you know. But yeah, but it's a it's a rough game. So
And thinking about teaching, I know you mentioned Eve Sedgwick as someone
uh,
who's really important to you. What and she comes up time and time again, and I something that has stuck with me is her notion of paranoid versus reparative reading, and what was it about being her student or her work that has seemed to have sustained you, or you can find so much in it over and over again.
yeah, I mean, if anyone listening to this podcast, you know, there's any takeaways, just like to be immersed in Sedgwick's work is a really fruitful activity. I think that, yeah, that paranoid reparative reading uh, essay that is so, you know, widely read, I think is it's very, I think it's very it's kind of evergreen insofar as these kind of urges towards the paranoid and the reparative and the ways in which they, you know, crisscross each other, either appearing in the guise of each other, you know, or one appearing to kind of check the other, you know, or one growing and the other diminishing, you know, depending on what kind of practice you're trying to set forth. And I think, yeah, I mean, this book, you know, Eve wrote a book called A Dialogue on Love, and was interested in love, and was also near the end of her life, you know, very interested in Tibetan Buddhism and other things. And I think, you know, it wasn't really studying with Eve per se, because I wasn't, I mean, clearly I knew her, and we had a relationship, but I wasn't, you know, like I wouldn't like count myself as like a friend of hers, or no, not like that kind of intimacy there. But I think my intimacy was being in her orbit, uh, seeing how she taught, and then also just the work, you know, reading the work. And I think the work and the way, from the way that she makes sentences to the objects of her thought to her own uh, instinct for the reparative, and kind of showing a rigorous fashion of turning away from the paranoid, not like a kumbaya way of, you know, that we're going to collapse into a kind of self-caring blob, but like that there's a rigor to the process of engaging in the reparative. Anyway, all of which is to say that, you know, her book, A Dialogue on Love, as well as Hilton Als's phrase and other things, probably influenced, you know, my desire to, you know, get the word love into the title of this book, even though it's clearly, you know, when invoked, it's always, you know, at risk of the cheesy. But I think whether it's bell hooks or anybody who's um, taken a step out to kind of try and apply some rigor and apply some heart to the concept, usually is of interest to me. So.
Hmm. It's funny that I makes me think at the store, All About Love has been a top seller. Like it is
Wow.
always there, always selling out, and
Wow.
that tells you everything in terms of what we need, And
Yeah. Funny. Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing because it's not very. It's like whether from political movements to interpersonal life, people like decry the lack of love or care or community or all these things. But again, back to like the skill set, it's kind of like, well, do we even know how to have these things? Like, can we have nice things? Like, can we even have them? Can we even allow them like to ourselves? Like, maybe like, so I think I'm glad that it's a bestseller and that it seems to indicate that people are asking those questions and going out to seek guidance, instead of kind of, glutting ourselves on the paranoid and wondering why we don't have any space for love. We're like sending out barbs at every other person in our life in every other way and not making anyone. What's the old adage? I can't remember, an activist who said, you always remember how people made, not what they said, but how they made you feel. And it's like, if we're just running around making each other feel bad all the time, but wondering why we feel bad, then like, we have like a task in front of us,
Totally. What are you reading right now, or what's on your mind? Is there anything that's exciting you of late?
Oh boy, let's see. Well, I don't know. It's always a good question. I'm just looking around my desk because I can never remember anything. Let's see, what do I have on my desk? Well, I'm gonna write a little introduction for a reissue of my friend Michelle T's book Valencia. I have this new book by Ann Carson, Wrong Norma. I have a Fred Moten book in manuscript that I'm gonna do a reader's report for. That's 380 pages of more good stuff to come. I've got yeah, I don't know. I'm like, I feel bad because Paul Auster died and I never had read much of him. So I'm going to try and read the New York trilogy in homage. I don't know. So yeah, those are a few things,
Mm-hmm. I was so happy to see your essay on Fred in this book, just because it also was just wonderful to hear someone like you admit that they struggle with the or that yes. But I've been lucky enough to be in a room with him and to hear him speak, and just you captured so wonderfully his profundity, and I just Fred's Fredness, which I really appreciated, and I so hope that this book also introduces people to his work, and I love seeing Sadia Hartman and the ways that you draw thinkers together in a way that feels so, like, I keep harping on, but very expansive. And because I still find, especially maybe even in academia, or I write about art, I feel so frustrated in the ways that we're still so siloed, or these conversations, whether it's about queer politics or Black radical thought, are so still can be separated and seen as not relevant to each other. And I was introduced to people that I never would have been in reading your work, and the way that you very intentionally reference and cite feels, not casual to me. It's
yeah. That's kind of the key, right? It's like, how do you do the work such that you're not like, especially in like a kind of politically a charged arena where it's like, you have a lot of, white folks who want to drop a lot of names and you just don't get the vibe that there's, the work behind it. It's like, I think the question for me is often like how to do all the work, so that you've like struggled and digested and tried to hear things that either, but then how to not have, if you're not interested in reproducing an academic idiom, like how do you have the work, as what you're saying about the Moten piece about Black and Blur in this book, like, I'm not going to reproduce the kind of challenges to accessibility, that maybe Moten is more comfortable with, or like even adamant about, like in his work, because it's not my style. So, but you don't want it to be, yeah, but like you don't want to like glide the surface. So it's like, I think, but that's just kind of one example. Like there's so many examples where, and then there's also like risks that you take in, a lot of thinkers. I mean, I'm just thinking like, you name it, Fanon, like Arendt, like you name it, like you, dragging adages from their work out of their context is very tricky business, and so that's part of what I say when I said earlier that like taking what you need and leaving the rest can be like it's tricky business because um that's kind of like the business of like dragging people's quotes around social media, like, to kind of like burnish a revolutionary profile or different things, when it's like sometimes like you'll read things, you'll be like, that is not even what that person meant, or that passage wasn't like about that. And so, um, but I'm like guilty of both. It's like that I'm guilty of it because like that's the risk that you take in decontextualizing. But you have to decontextualize if you want to drag thought around and have different people talk to each other. So it's just, I mean, I think about that a lot, and it's just work. Like it's work just to do it in a way that you feel good about how you did it. It just takes labor, really.
When you're working on projects, do you tend to think in books, or are you sort of just writing and collecting? Like, what is your process generally like?
Yeah, I generally think in books, which is why making this book of essays was fun, because it was proof that I don't always think in books, which is kind of how I think of it. I think I say that in the interview with Ellie Miles, like we're talking and I just say, I'm always like the book, the book, the book. And I think it's because I get a lot of periodicals and, Substack people. Like I see a lot of people writing in shorter form, and I think, God, like who has the time, or like or something. Like I just think, why isn't everyone writing like the books, So, but then I think I look at this book and I think, oh no, like I do have a practice of writing in shorter form. I just don't typically publish anything in kind of like the New York Review of Books, like New Yorker type, like Harper's kind of like that kind of essayistic arena is not one that I've yet really been involved with. I think just because I don't think in terms of like the essay, and also I don't know, like the form of what I'm working on is always very. I mean, it's partly why I'm looking at this, Anne Carson's Wrong Norma, and like I'm just like, it's like some of these things are like big blocks of text, and some of them, are just falling into like other like. I feel a lot of kinship with her when I feel like I don't know what this is going to be. So how could I have prematurely done it on assignment for a periodical that knows what form they're looking for? So yeah, there's like a space of discovery that I kind of try and grant myself. And luckily, writing for art catalogs, if you're asked to write about an artist, the first thing I'll say is, can it look like anything, any length, any form, anything? They say sure, and then you say right. So it's a very easy milieu in that way.
Mm. Do you still write poetry, or what relationship does
Yeah.
it occupy in your life?
Yeah. I haven't written any poems for a long time. I think poetry is like a art of inspiration, not perspiration. It's a distinction Sylvia Plath made, and I think and I think it's seems to me like it fairly holds up. So I kind of just feel like I'm open to, I think Allen Ginsberg said, like, when the muse calls, answer. Like I'm open to like answering, but I'm not. I don't care enough. Like it's not like a net positive to me enough that I would try and make the muse call.
Sure, absolutely. What about fiction? Have you ever dabbled? I was really intrigued by the essay that you write about your friend Lhasa.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And there's this moment where you're saying, if I were to write, the novel
Yeah,
of us, and I was
right.
like, oh, what would that novel be, Maggie?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not like I think I have enough friends who are novelists to kind of have a feeling of what, not that there's only one thing, but like I sense something in them that's about fictive space and how it works for them that I don't quite yet. It's not like a cabinet of my mind that is, that does work for me or is activated. So again, if it became activated, I would. I mean, I think maybe because I came up in like lyric poetry, I'm less interested in kind of the fiction, autofiction conversation, as I just see most all writing, even when it's in the first person or even when it's true, as like instantaneously creating a kind of speculative space of address or storytelling that is very aestheticized, and whether or not that's with made up people or a speaker that has like a relationship to the self, to me, it doesn't feel totally. So, like, sometimes people call Bluets a novel, and I'm kind of like, no, it's all true. But what does that mean to be true? Like, I don't have a Princess of Blue, like that. Those are allegorical names. Um, but yeah, I mean, if that space of suspension tipped into like the fiction cabinet, I'd be perfectly happy to listen to what was there.
Do you ever feel frustrated by maybe these genre distinctions that get placed on you, or certain, or I don't know, are there things about the way that people have reacted
Yeah,
to to writing that has surprised you, or that you, I don't know.
it's more just like, I mean, I wrote a book on the New York School once, the New York School of Poetry and Painting, and like when I set out to interview people for that book, like specifically women who'd been associated with the New York School, like they were all super hostile to my querying about the school. I think Alice Notley, one of the poets, like told me a funny joke about like how many like poets does it take to screw a woman into a movement, or something, like a light bulb joke kind of variation. And like, but it really clued me into, like, now that I'm much older, I was in my 20s then, now that I'm much older, I'm kind of like, I think I understand more the kind of irritated deflection that people feel when people come at them so often with like affiliations or schools or names or trends, because as a writer you're just trying to stay fugitive and like alive to your curiosity, and a lot of the names and the categories and the genre discussions are kind of like, it just sounds like the sound of like nails in the coffin of your creative life. So I try not to be like too obviously irritated, but I think that it's just possible that writers who are trying to innovate are not necessarily the best spokespeople for conversations about classification and genre.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like, like Paul Beatty's not like, I'm going to write a novel that, transforms the notion of humor from like, it's just not, you're just more like, oh, what if there was a guy and he's like, like you're just doing something else. And the other conversation is very super ego and very after the fact, and is very disruptive if it's in the room, I find.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's also like a young person's question of,
Because I was young when I was asking.
yeah, and I have definitely felt that,
Yeah.
tendency as well. And maybe
Yeah.
it's about, you see someone who has defined a thing and you want to, yeah, I think there's something about the distancing or something.
Yeah, I do wonder that too. Like maybe, at least for myself, I think like when I arrived in New York, like I was trying to figure out what had happened before you got there, and like really trying to figure, and then part of that is a classification project, and then I think it's really only through living that you also can see that like any individual writer has like, you know, multiple legacies moving through them. I mean, I was just thinking about this. I was looking at my colleague, Percival Everett's book, James, and like just thinking about like, obviously Twain is like the progenitor and like the, of that project, but like, you could tell Percival's story as a writer through so many different, families of association, like that you wanted to, and there isn't like one, and I think that often there's just one that's like visible to the younger critic, because they're trying to make sense of something, but like the writer will be like, well, why can't I be a part of this? Or why can't I be part of, or why don't you see me as part of this, you know? And I think that can be especially frustrating, you know, like if somebody's like, obviously with the, you know, classifications around demographics of like, this is gay writing, this is female writing, this is Black writing, is whatever. And it's like, you know, it's very natural, it's very normal to me that people would be like, you know, like in the essay about Hervé Goubert that I have in this book, French writer, you know, I say something like I just as an experiment, I was kind of trying to be like, well, what if instead of we were talking about like autobiography or whatever, what if we're instead of calling this tradition queer, like what if we were calling it in Baum's phrase, like body smeared, you know, philosophical writing, you know, like, and I thought, well, who are body smeared philosophical writers? And like, that's going to produce a different list than another one, then a queer autobiography canon will produce, you know, like, it's just, so it's like, you just, I think it's interesting to just keep asking questions about the propensity to want to make a canon, to enforce a canon, to create terms, to classify, and to value and devalue, because I think a lot of these ways, things that we do are ways to be like, you make a thing and then you say, is it bad or good? You know, kind of like that, and that kind of critical sport. Like, I'm like, well, let's go back to where we made it. Cause like, why did we make it? Like, I mean, that's like the Foucauldian in me. I'm like, what service is it providing that we made it? Why do we believe in the New York School? What is, and why, if certain bodies keep falling out of literary art history, why? Like what about, or what about what we're doing doesn't allow them to, you know, certain bodies to be a part of the story, you know? So just putting them back into a story where they've been structurally kept out does not, like, that's a restorative project and it has its values, but it doesn't actually change the story, you know?
Oh, right. Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Percival because he was at Skylight, and a version of what we're talking about, I feel like played out in a Q&A, and where this demand to answer questions that were, yeah, you could feel maybe Percival's desire to be free, and you know, and audiences, desire to define.
Yeah, it's like you know, it's difficult. Like, I listen to people like Percival and other people who I think I have like, I think I mean, I could be wrong, and they're all like differently demographically like inflected, but I think I have a feeling of what they're feeling, and then I watch people to see how different people, you know, evade binds, you know, like, because you know, in the Argonauts, I quote like Deleuze saying, like, you know, the question is to get out, you know, get out of, you know, I can't remember what the phrase is now, like, you know, whatever bind, you know, not you've been put in. And then I also talk about this, I don't know where I have it. Oh, I think it may be also be in the Argonauts about like John Cage just being like, get out of whatever cage you're in. And like, I think that feeling of wanting to, and Roland Barthes to me is very foundational on this account with like his book, The Neutral, and this kind of like, whenever the, like what you were describing before, like whenever the walls are closing in, like that feeling to kind of seeing what the available options are, because maybe there's door 3, you know, that like, it felt like you were trapped, but you didn't know that there was this other door. And, you know, often again, like in a Q&A, often you're trying to do that on the spot. Like you're trying to find door 3 on the spot. And
sure,
that's hard to do.
Quite difficult. And,
but it's a game. Like, again, it reminds me like where we started with improvisatory dance. Like, you know, all the time you get into an improvisatory situation where you're like, oh shit, this person jumped on my back. You know, I don't really want them to be my back, but like, you know, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do in this moment?
Now that I'm here.
Yeah, and then even people in comedy, you know, the whole yes and thing. You know, I mean, I think it's all I mean, we're doing that all the time as we live. You know, you know, we're doing that with the, you know, grocery store clerk or whatever. Every question someone says, "How are you?" and you just got like horrible news, and you're just like, now you're in the bind. Like you say, good, bad, or tell them how things actually are, or door 3. You know, like what a minute of the day. You know, with those kinds of things.
Okay, my last question.
Okay, great.
I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Yeah,
But, I know this is a question I know a lot of writers loathe, but what are you thinking about? Is there a book that's next? Or, I'm sure revisiting your work opened up
yeah,
things for
yeah.
you. Just what's on your mind?
Yeah, I don't know. I had a really I wrote like a little book during COVID that has a weird name. It's called Pathomata, which is like a name of a symptomology. Pathomata, or the story of my mouth, and it's based on dreams, which is a kind of like a fiction adjacent space, and that book was really fun because it had no like citation or anything. It was purely like I feel like during the pandemic, a lot of us like reading became hard, and I didn't go to anyone's studio and I was not, so there was a kind of deep dive into like you're in the house and then you're in your mind and then you're in your unconscious, and so the book um was really a result of that. So I just finished that, and it'll come out next year, and so that'll be fun.
Exciting.
Yeah, it's very small. It's going to come out with Wave Books, which is a small press that did my book Bluets, but they kind of have they both live in a similar allegorical space, so it seemed like a good match.
Well, that's it for me,
Okay,
Maggie.
great. Thanks for talking. So great to talk to you. I hope that I meet you sometime. Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully, if you're, in the store, love to meet.
Okay, great. Okay.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
You too.
Okay,
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.